The rope was already swaying in the dry Kansas wind when Jennie Hawkins stepped out of the crowd and told the hangman to stop. The year was 1873, and the town of Caldwell sat like a sun-scorched wound on the edge of the Indian Territory border, a place where cattle drives ended and trouble had a way of beginning. Dust devils spun lazy circles in the main street, and the smell of horse sweat and leather hung over everything like a second sky. The gallows had been built 3 days prior, hammered together by a man named Chester Cole who moonlighted as the town undertaker, which struck most people as a practical arrangement. The crowd that had gathered was the kind of crowd a hanging always pulled curious children hoisted on their father's shoulders, women with handkerchiefs already pressed to their faces, men with arms folded who wore their expressions the way they wore their hats, pulled low and giving nothing away. Jennie Hawkins stood 5 feet 4 inches in her worn leather boots, a woman of 28 years with chestnut hair pinned beneath a dark bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water in summer shifting between green and gray, depending on what the light decided to do. She wore a black dress, still mourning, though Thomas Hawkins had been in the ground for 11 months now, struck down by a fever that had moved through their homestead like a ghost and taken him in 4 days. She had buried him herself because the ground needed breaking and there was no one else to do it. She had not cried at the grave, though she had cried in the barn afterward, alone among the horses who did not judge her. She was not a woman who made dramatic gestures. That was what made the moment so strange, even to herself. The man on the gallows was not from Caldwell. Nobody seemed entirely sure where he was from. His name, according to Sheriff Dale Prout, was Eli Granger, and he was accused of robbing the Merchants' Bank of Caldwell 4 days prior. The robbery had been clean, no one hurt, approximately $400 taken, and the only witness who had identified Eli Granger was a man named Warren Cook, who happened to be the bank's part owner and who had, in Jennie's careful observation over the past 3 days, been drinking heavily and telling different versions of the same story each time he told it. She had come to the hanging because she had come to every public gathering in the 11 months since Thomas died, because standing still in the homestead made the grief press down on her chest like a boot on wet earth. She had not intended to speak. She had not known the man on the gallows at all. But when the sheriff read the charges aloud, and the condemned man stood there with his hands bound behind him and his jaw set with a quiet, exhausted kind of dignity, and when she remembered what she had heard Warren Cook say at the saloon 2 nights ago, which contradicted in specific and important ways what he had said in his sworn testimony, something in her simply would not permit the hanging to proceed. "Stop," she said, and the word came out louder than she had expected, cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a stone through still water. The hangman, a heavy-set man named Gill who wore a flour sack hood more out of tradition than any real desire for anonymity, everyone in Caldwell knew it was him, paused with his hand on the lever. Sheriff Prout, a tall man with a gray mustache and the tired eyes of someone who had lived too long in a place where the law was more suggestion than certainty, turned toward her with the look of a man who wanted very much for this morning to proceed as planned. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, in the tone men used when they meant to be polite while also dismissing you entirely, "this is not the place." "I have something to say regarding the evidence," she said, and she walked forward through the crowd, which parted the way crowds do for someone moving with enough certainty. She stopped at the base of the gallows steps, and she looked up at the man who was about to be hanged. He was looking at her. He was perhaps 30 years old, lean but broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and 3 days of beard across a jaw that was angular and weathered. His eyes were the kind of dark brown that looked nearly black in certain lights, and they were fixed on her with an expression she could not immediately classify, not relief, not desperation, but something watchful and still, the way a man looks when he has accepted his fate, and then finds at the last moment that someone has placed a question mark at the end of a sentence he thought was finished. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and something in that looking settled in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of a deep well. "Mrs. Hawkins," Sheriff Pruitt said again, "I am going to have to ask you to step back." "Warren Cook told two different stories," she said, loudly enough for the crowd. "At his sworn testimony on Tuesday, he stated that the robber came through the back door of the bank and that he had light-colored eyes. On Wednesday evening at the Dusty Boot Saloon, I was present when he told the story again, and he said the man came through the front door and that he could not see the eyes because of the bandana." "A man cannot come through two different doors, Sheriff, and a man cannot both have visible light eyes and an obscuring bandana at the same time." The crowd shifted. That particular sound a group of people makes when they have heard something that changes the shape of a thing, a low collective recalibration. Pruitt's jaw tightened. "That is not legal testimony, Mrs. Hawkins. That is hearsay from a saloon." "I am prepared to say it under oath," she said. "I am prepared to say under oath and before God that Warren Cook's account of events is inconsistent in ways that would make a fair-minded person doubt his identification. And I am asking you, Sheriff, whether you mean to hang a man on the word of someone who cannot keep his own story straight." The silence that followed was of the particular variety that precedes the changing of a thing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A horse somewhere behind the crowd shifted its weight and blew air through its nose. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the man on the gallows. He looked at Warren Cook, who stood to the left of the scaffold with his thumbs in his belt, and a face that had gone from florid to pale in the course of about 45 seconds. "Bring the prisoner down," Pruitt said at last, with the voice of a man who will be arguing about this for the rest of his natural life. "We will delay the execution pending review of testimony." There was a sound from the crowd's surprise, some grumbling, and here and there the particular exhale of relief that people make when they did not know they were holding their breath until they stop. The hangman stepped back from the lever with what seemed like genuine relief. Chester Cole, the undertaker, looked frustrated. Two deputies mounted the scaffold stairs and untied the man's hands from behind him and walked him down the steps. When his boots hit the ground, the solid, ordinary ground that he had not been entirely sure he would touch again, he stopped walking and turned to look at her. She was standing 3 feet away. The rope still hung from his neck, looped loose now that the knot had been removed from the drop position, and one of the deputies was pulling it away. The man's wrists were still red from the binding. He had a cut above his left eyebrow that she had not noticed from the distance, and his shirt was torn at the collar, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had been through a great deal in a short time, and had decided that surviving it was all he could reasonably manage. He looked at her and he said quietly, with a voice that was lower than she had expected and carried a particular roughness, like a road that had been traveled hard, "What is your name?" She blinked. Of all the things she had imagined he might say, she had not imagined that. "Jennie Hawkins," she said. "Jennie Hawkins," he repeated, and something in the way he said it made it sound as though he was committing it to memory, pressing it into a place where it would not be lost. "You are welcome," she said, a little tartly because the situation seemed to warrant it. The ghost of a smile moved across his face. "I was getting to that," he said. They took him back to the jailhouse, and Jennie walked home to her homestead 2 miles outside of town, and she told herself, quite firmly, that she had done the right thing because it was the right thing and for no other reason, and that was the end of it. It was not, of course, the end of it. The review of testimony that Sheriff Pruitt had reluctantly committed to took 3 days. During those 3 days, Eli Granger sat in the Caldwell jailhouse in a cell with a cot and a tin cup and a view of the main street through a single barred window. And he thought about the woman who had walked out of a crowd and told a hangman to stop. He had ridden into Caldwell 5 days ago with $30 to his name, and a horse named Augustus who had a tendency to bite strangers and a sound left foreleg, which were the things that mattered most. He had come from Wichita, where he had been working cattle on the Rocking H outfit for 2 years, and he had come south because a man named Frank Delane, who ran a livery in Caldwell, had sent word through a mutual acquaintance that he needed a wrangler through the winter months and was willing to pay fair wages. Eli had arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, made arrangements to meet Delane the following morning, eaten a supper of beans and salt pork at the boarding house, and gone to sleep. On Wednesday, someone had robbed the Merchants' Bank of Caldwell, and on Thursday morning, Warren Cook had pointed at Eli Granger in the street and said that was the man. Eli had not robbed any bank. He had been at the livery yard with Frank Delane's foreman at the time of the robbery, a fact that Delane's foreman had confirmed to the sheriff before, for reasons that Eli did not fully understand, recanting his statement and leaving town. The recantation had puzzled Prout, who was not by nature an unjust man, but in a town where banks getting robbed created the kind of disorder that made men in authority nervous, the path of least resistance had been to proceed with the man already in custody. The execution had been scheduled with what Eli felt was uncommon speed. He was not a man given to self-pity, but he had stood on those gallows steps and looked out at the Kansas sky and thought, in a way that was more curious than frightened by then, that this was a considerable amount of trouble for a man who had only wanted to wrangle horses through the winter. And then the woman had stepped out of the crowd. He thought about her steadily and without particular embarrassment during those 3 days, because there was not a great deal else to do, and because of the quality of her voice when she had spoken, the way she had simply stated the inconsistencies without melodrama or pleading, clear-eyed and direct as a well-drawn map, had lodged itself in his memory in a way he could not displace. Prout came to see him on the second day. He settled himself in the chair across from the cell with the manner of a man who was recalibrating. Frank Delane's foreman came back, Prout said. Name of Amos Reed. He says he was pressured by Warren Cook to change his statement. He is willing to testify to that. Is he? Eli said. Cook had a gambling debt to a man in Wichita, Prout said. We think the actual robber was hired through that connection, and Cook identified you because you were a stranger in town and nobody would miss you. He said this last part in the flat tone of a man stating a fact he finds uncomfortable. That is reassuring to know, Eli said. Prout looked at him from beneath the gray mustache. I want to be clear that I was following procedure. You were following a witness statement and the pressure to keep order, Eli said. I understand it. I don't love it, but I understand it. You will be released tomorrow morning, Prout said. I am sorry for the difficulty. He paused at the door on the way out. Mrs. Hawkins, he said without turning around, is a woman of considerable character. You would do well to remember that. I remember it already, Eli said. He was released on the third morning in possession of his horse, his saddle, his $30, his hat, and the name of a free man. He stood in front of the jailhouse in the early Kansas sun and breathed air that had the particular sweetness that air always has when you have recently considered losing access to it permanently. And then he asked the deputy which direction was east of town and where Mrs. Jennie Hawkins lived. The deputy gave him a long look. 2 miles east, he said. Homestead with a gray barn. Her husband passed last year. Thank you, Eli said, and he got on Augustus, who attempted to bite the deputy for good measure, and he rode east. Jennie was mending a fence post on the east side of her property when she heard hoofbeats, and she stood up with the mallet still in her hand and watched the rider come down the road. The horse was a big roan with a particular energy about him, and the rider sat easy in the saddle in the way of someone who had been on horseback long enough that it was simply where the body went. She recognized him when he was still 50 yards out, and something in her chest did a thing that she decided to classify as simple human recognition and leave it at that. He stopped Augustus at the fence line and touched the brim of his hat. Mrs. Hawkins, he said. Mr. Granger, she said, you are out. Released this morning, he said. The real story came clear. Good, she said. I am glad. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the fence post she had been working on, and then he climbed down from Augustus, tied the reins to the existing fence and said, "May I help with that?" She blinked. "You do not have to do that." "I know," he said, and held out his hand for the mallet. She looked at the hand. It was a working man's hand, the knuckles prominent, a scar across the back of 2 fingers from something she did not know the story of. She handed him the mallet. He worked for 2 hours. He was good at it, efficient and without waste of motion, the way people are when physical work is something they have done for long enough that it becomes language. She worked beside him, holding posts while he drove them, and they did not talk much at first, which she found was not uncomfortable in the way that silence sometimes is, but rather the ordinary companionship of 2 people engaged in a shared task. "You did not need to come out here," she said when they had moved to the south side and the sun had climbed to noon. "To thank me, a nod in the street would have served." "I know," he said again. He drove the post flush and straightened up, wiping the back of his wrist across his forehead. "I wanted to come out here." She looked at him squarely because she was a woman who found that the direct approach saved a great deal of trouble. "Why?" He met her eyes and held them, and he said with a plainness that she appreciated, "Because I spent 3 days thinking about the woman who walked out of a crowd for a man she did not know, and I wanted to see if she was as remarkable up close as she seemed from the gallows." She was quiet for a moment. "And is she?" she asked, with a dryness that she deployed when she was covering something else. The corner of his mouth moved. "More so," he said. She turned back to the fence and said nothing, but she was not unpleased. He stayed for the noon meal because she offered it, and she offered it because it would have been rude not to, and for no other reason. She made cornbread and salt pork and beans, the honest currency of the prairie kitchen, and they sat at her kitchen table, which was small and had 4 chairs, 2 of which had been Thomas's and hers, and 2 of which had been meant for children who had not come. She had put away the 4th chair after Thomas died, and had for a time considered putting away the 3rd but had not, because she was not yet ready to declare herself entirely alone. Eli Granger sat in the 3rd chair and ate cornbread and told her how he had come to be in Caldwell, the full story of it, the cattle driving, the work in Wichita, the letter from Frank Delane's outfit, the Tuesday arrival and the Wednesday accusation and the Thursday gallows. He told it without complaint and without self-pity, and she listened and asked 2 careful questions that he answered honestly. "What will you do now?" she asked when the meal was done and she had poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the steam. "Delane still wants a wrangler," he said, "if the offer stands after the commotion. I will go speak with him this afternoon." He paused. "And you, what will you do?" She looked at him, slightly surprised by the return of the question because people in her experience did not often ask. "What I always do," she said. "Work the homestead, see it through." "Alone?" he said. "Yes," she said simply. He nodded slowly, with the look of a man thinking through something carefully. He did not offer an opinion about whether she ought to be alone, which she noted and filed away with approval. "Then I hope it goes well for you," he said, and stood and put on his hat, and thanked her for the meal with a sincerity that was particular and specific in a way that general politeness rarely is. He said her name again when he left, Mrs. Hawkins. In that same way he had said it at the gallows, as though it was something worth holding carefully. She stood at the door and watched him ride back toward town, and the wind moved through the tall grass in long waves, and she thought that the 3rd chair at the kitchen table had not felt empty today, and then she went back inside and did not think about it for the rest of the afternoon. She mostly succeeded. Frank Delane was a compact, square-shouldered man of 50, who wore his white hair short under a brown hat, and spoke in the deliberate way of someone who had learned the hard way that careless words cost money. He received Eli in his office above the livery at 4 in the afternoon, and confirmed, without ceremony, that the wrangler position was still available, and that the business with Warren Cook was, in his view, a shameful episode that the town would do well to reckon with. "Cook had the bank put up 1/3 of the money to build this livery 2 years ago," Delane said, turning a pen over in his fingers. which means I am in the uncomfortable position of being partly beholden to a man who tried to get an innocent person hanged. What will happen to him? Eli asked. Pruitt is pursuing charges, Delane said. Cook has money and a lawyer coming from Wichita, so the outcome is uncertain. But the town knows what he did. In a place this size, that is its own kind of reckoning. He looked at Eli steadily. You are not a man who will carry that grudge into my livery and make it my problem. No, Eli said. Good, Delane said, and stood and extended his hand. You start Monday, $3 a week and a bunk in the rear building. The horses are your responsibility and I have high standards. So do I, Eli said, and they shook. He took the bunk that evening and spent the weekend learning the horses. 12 of them, ranging from a sweet-tempered buckskin mare to an ornery gray gelding named Absalom who had an opinion about everything and expressed it with his ears. Eli found that the horses were in generally good condition, their stalls clean enough and their feet recently shod, but that they needed more consistent handling than they had been getting, and he began immediately to correct this, working each animal with the patient, systematic attention that good horse work demands. On Sunday, he rode Augustus out east along the Caldwell Road in the early morning light, not with any particular intention, he told himself, just to get a feel for the territory. He did not stop at the Hawkins homestead. He did not even slow down when he passed it, though he noted, in the way a man notes things he finds important, that the fence he had helped mend looked solid in the morning light, and that there was smoke from the chimney, and that the gray barn had a new board on its south side that had been nailed up recently, and that the garden along the east wall of the house had been turned over and planted with the kind of neat, determined rows that spoke of someone who put effort into things that mattered. He rode on, and he did not circle back, because that would have been something he was not prepared to label yet. Caldwell on a weekday had a particular rhythm. The cattle buyers and the trail bosses in the morning, the commerce of the main street through the midday, the saloons beginning their long evening hours, and the ordinary life of the people who lived there moving through all of it, the women at the mercantile, the children in the dusty street, the minister at his window with his eternal expression of optimistic concern. Jennie came into town on Wednesdays for her supplies. She had always done this, even before Thomas died, because Wednesday was not a cattle drive day, and the mercantile was less crowded, and the prices did not fluctuate with the trail boss spending the way they did on Fridays. She tied her horse, a steady quarter horse mare named Pearl, who Thomas had bought the spring before he died, at the rail in front of Hobbs' mercantile, and went in with her list. She had been inside for 15 minutes, working through flour and salt and lamp oil, and considering whether she could justify the extravagance of a new pair of work gloves, when the door opened and Eli Granger came in behind her. She turned and he stopped, and both of them said nothing for a brief moment in which the situation recalibrated. "Mrs. Hawkins," he said, and touched his hat. "Mr. Granger," she said, and something about the routine of the exchange, its formality, its repetition made her want to smile, which she contained with reasonable success. "Working for Delane's livery," he said, by way of explanation for his presence, nodding toward the counter where a list of items for the stable were clearly on his mind. "He needs several things." "How are the horses?" she asked, and the question came out naturally because she was genuinely interested, because horses were a thing she understood. His face changed in the small way that faces change when someone asks the right question. "They are good," he said. "Good stock. A gray gelding who is working through some trust issues, but we are getting along." She smiled at that genuinely, the first full smile of the day. "Thomas always said the difficult horses were the ones that taught you the most," she said, and then the saying of Thomas's name moved through her the way it still did, with a kind of ache that was quieter now than it had been but had not yet finished. He saw it, she could tell, not with pity, which she could not have borne, but with a simple recognition. "He sounds like a man who knew horses," he said. "He did," she said. "He knew most things worth knowing." There was a brief silence that was not awkward. "Are you well?" he asked. "The homestead," Is it manageable? Mostly, she said. The north well is giving trouble. The pump needs a part that I have ordered from the hardware, but it has not come in yet. I am hauling water from the creek in the meantime. That is a hard job in October, he said. Most jobs are hard in October, she said. He bought his supplies and she bought hers, and they walked out of the mercantile at the same time and stood for a moment on the boardwalk in the thin October sunshine, their respective horses at the rail. The street moved around them, a wagon passing, two men in conversation at the barber shop door, a dog trotting with great purposeful energy toward an unknown destination. I could take a look at the pump, he said. Saturday morning, if you like. She looked at him, reading the offer. It was made plainly, without weight or suggestion, the way an offer is made by someone who means exactly what they say and nothing more elaborate. Thank you, she said. Saturday morning would be fine. He touched his hat brim again and went to collect his horse, and she stood a moment longer on the boardwalk, watching him go with an expression she was glad no one was close enough to interpret. He came Saturday with tools in his saddle bag, and a directness of purpose that she found she was already coming to expect from him. The pump mechanism needed a new leather washer and a realignment of the rod simpler than she had feared, and he worked through it methodically, his hands certain, while she held things and handed tools and told him the history of the well, which had been dug by Thomas in the second year of their marriage when the original water source had run poor. You were married long? He asked, not intrusively, just in the natural way of conversation between people working together. 6 years, she said. We came out from Missouri together. Thomas had 160 acres in his head and a will to work them that I could not argue with. She was quiet for a moment. We were happy. That is not a thing I take for granted. He looked at her with the steady dark eyes that she was learning were the most honest part of him. You loved him, he said. Yes, she said, and I miss him every day, but I am not the kind of woman who stops living because a person she loves has stopped. He would not have wanted that. No, Eli said thoughtfully. That kind of love does not ask that of you. She looked at him carefully. You speak as though you know something about it. He returned to the pump for a moment, making a final adjustment before he answered. My mother lost my father when I was 12, he said. Cattle work. She grieved him hard and thoroughly, and then she planted her garden in the spring and kept going. She said he would have been irritated with her for anything less. He tested the pump handle and water came up clean and strong. There you go, he said, straightening. She pumped the handle herself, feeling the good resistance of a mechanism that was working right, and said, Thank you, Eli. The name came out before she had decided to use it, and they both registered the change without comment, though she saw something shift in his expression, something careful and warm at the same time. You are welcome, Jennie, he said, and that was all, and she did not examine too closely why the sound of her name in his voice felt different from how it felt in anyone else's. He stayed for coffee again. This time he asked about the farm-specific questions, the condition of the soil, the yield from the previous growing season, what she meant to plant in spring, whether the cattle she was running were her own or leased range. She answered everything, and she found herself speaking about the land with a fullness she had not spoken with since Thomas died, because there had been no one to speak with about it who wanted to know, really know, rather than simply asking out of politeness and waiting for her to finish. You know what you are doing, he said, not as flattery but as observation. I learned, she said. I did not grow up farming. My father ran a dry goods store in St. Louis. I learned it all from Thomas, and then I learned the rest of it myself when I had to. That is the best kind of knowing, he said. She poured more coffee and asked about his own history, and he told her more than he had before, that he had grown up in Ohio, his father a blacksmith who died when Eli was 17 in an accident that had not been dramatic but had been permanent. His mother had remarried a decent man eventually. He had 2 sisters, both of whom were settled in Ohio, still with families of their own. He had come west at 19 because the West had seemed like the place where a man could build something from what he had rather than from what he had inherited, and he had been building that something for 11 years now with the particular slow patience of a person who does not expect anything quickly but does not stop expecting it. "What is the something?" she asked. "The thing you are building." He looked at his coffee cup for a moment, then at her. "A life that means something," he said. "A place. Work that is honest. People worth standing next to." He said it without elaboration, as though these were sufficient and self-evident things, which she supposed they were. She walked with him to the gate when he left, Pearl watching them with calm equine disinterest from the pasture. Augustus, tied at the post, swiveled his ears and looked at Jennie with the measuring expression of a horse deciding whether she was trustworthy. She put her hand out slowly, palm up, and he sniffed it, and then he allowed her to stroke his nose, which Eli watched with visible surprise. "He does not let most people do that," he said. "He is deciding whether I am genuine," she said. "Horses can tell." Eli looked at her for a moment with an expression she did not quite have a name for yet, though she was beginning to develop one. "Yes," he said, "they can." He rode away, and she stood at the gate until he was past the bend in the road, and then she went inside. And for the first time since Thomas died, the house felt not empty but inhabited, as though the walls had absorbed the memory of a conversation and were holding it like warmth. October turned, and the wind came down from the north with more intention. The Kansas sky turned that particular shade of deep blue that preceded hard weather, and the sunsets went purple and violent over the flat horizon. Eli worked the horses through the shortening days and thought about Jennie Hawkins with the steady attentiveness of a man who has found something that occupies the best part of his mind and does not displace it with discipline. He saw her on Wednesdays at the Mercantile always, and on Saturdays he had found reasons to ride out east, and she had found that she did not discourage this. They worked together on things that needed working: on a loose board on the barn, a gate hinge, a section of roof that was likely to cause trouble through the winter. He brought her news from town, that Warren Cook's lawyer had arrived from Wichita and that the trial was set for November, that the winter cattle shipments were beginning to slow, that the minister was organizing a community supper for the end of the month. She told him about the land, about the sky, about the particular book she was reading that Thomas had brought from Wichita 2 winters ago, a collection of essays by a man named Ralph Waldo Emerson, who had opinions about self-reliance that she found both instructive and occasionally irritating. She told him that she had started a second garden bed on the south side of the house, with an eye toward medicinal herbs in the spring, because the nearest doctor was 20 miles east, and she had found that lavender and calendula and a few other things well tended were worth more to a homestead than 2 trips to a physician. He listened to all of it with the full quality of attention that she had identified, by now, as one of his most distinctive traits. Not the polite surface attention of courtesy, but the real kind, the kind that remembers details and returns to them. One Wednesday, walking together from the Mercantile to their respective horses, he stopped at the window of the millinery shop and pointed to a bolt of fabric visible inside, a deep blue-green, the color of the sky just after the sun goes. "That would suit you," he said. She looked at the fabric and then at him, and the observation was so unguarded, so simply and naturally delivered, that she felt something loosen in her chest that she had been keeping tightly held. "Thomas used to say the same thing about that shade," she said carefully. He turned to look at her, not away. "I know you are not yet done grieving him," he said. "I am not asking you to be." "Eli," she said, and stopped. "You do not have to say anything," he said. "I just want to be clear that I am not in any hurry. I am not going anywhere. I am working horses for Frank Delane, and I intend to be here through the winter, and I find that I cannot make myself not come out east on Saturdays because you are the best company I have found in 11 years of looking for it. That is the whole of it, plainly said." She looked at him for a long moment, and the street moved around them, and somewhere down the way a man was singing badly to a song that deserved better, and the wind pushed the scent of cedar and coming cold between them. "I find I cannot make myself not be glad when Saturday comes," she said at last, which was as much as she was ready to offer, and he received it with a nod and no pressure, and they untied their horses and rode in their separate directions, and she thought about what she had said all the way home and found that she was not sorry she had said it. The community supper was held on the last Saturday of October in the meeting hall beside the Methodist church, which was large enough to seat 40 people at long tables if they did not mind their elbows touching their neighbors, which most people in Caldwell did not. The women brought covered dishes and the men brought what they had: cornbread, smoked meats, jars of last summer's preserves, and the evening had the particular quality of gatherings in small places where people know one another's business and choose, for one night, to simply be warm together. Jennie came in a dress that was not black. It was the closest thing she had to the blue-green of the fabric in the millinery window, a dark teal that Thomas had always liked. She was not sure precisely why she had chosen it. She told herself it was simply that November was coming and black was too cold a color for a lamplit room. Eli was already there when she arrived, standing near the far wall with Frank Delane and one of the other livery hands, a young man of about 20 named Henry Parks, who had the universal characteristic of young men in new places, which was enthusiasm about everything and expertise in very little. When Eli saw Jennie come in, the conversation he was having stopped mid-sentence in a way that Henry Parks noticed, and Delane, who was wiser, pretended not to. She saw him see her, and she allowed herself to hold his eyes for just a moment before she went to find a place to put her dish of sweet potatoes on the serving table. They ended up seated across from each other at the long table, with neighbors on both sides who talked and laughed and passed dishes, and generally occupied themselves with the business of the supper, which meant that Eli and Jennie could speak in the way that two people speak when they are technically in public, but conducting a private conversation by sheer virtue of its particular quality. He told her that Henry Parks had asked him that afternoon whether horses could count, inspired by Absalom the gray gelding, who had demonstrated a peculiar habit of touching his nose to any object Eli held up to him a corresponding number of times, and that Eli had said he did not know if horses could count, but that Absalom clearly could do something more interesting than simply stand in a stall and eat. She told him that the medicinal garden plan had expanded because she had spent the week reading her grandmother's recipe book, which she had brought from Missouri, and which contained remedies that her grandmother had learned from an elderly woman in St. Louis who had gotten them from her own grandmother, who had been enslaved on a Virginia plantation, and had carried her knowledge of plants and healing with her the way people carry the most precious things quietly at great cost without losing a word of it. He was quiet when she said that, in the thoughtful way she had come to know meant he was absorbing something. "Those women carried more than most people will ever know," he said. "Yes," she said, "and what they knew they kept alive. I want to honor that by using it." The supper went on around them, and at some point their conversation became the kind that requires less words, because it is conducted partly in the language of proximity and attention. The slight lean forward, the smile that responds to a thought rather than a sound, the eyes that return again and again across a table as though they cannot help it. When the evening ended and people were pulling on coats and carrying out empty dishes, Eli held the door open for her with the natural ease of a man for whom courtesy is habit rather than performance, and they stood for a moment on the steps of the meeting hall in the cold night air, the stars hard and brilliant above them, the way stars are in Kansas far from any city, as though there are simply more of them out here. "That color suits you," he said quietly, "just as I thought." She looked up at him, and there was not enough light to see his expression entirely, only the outline of him against the dark, steady, patient present. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and something in the way she said it carried a weight she was no longer entirely trying to conceal. "May I call on you?" he asked plainly, properly, not just to fix fences. She was quiet for a moment, The cold wind moved between them and was not uncomfortable. "Yes," she said, "you may." He walked her to her horse. Pearl waited philosophically at the rail, and he helped her mount, which she did not need but did not object to, and he stood watching her ride away into the dark of the Caldwell road until he could no longer hear the hoofbeats, and then he stood there a moment longer, because the night was remarkable and the moment deserved it. November arrived with frost and gray skies, and the particular industriousness that cold weather produces in people who live close to the land, for whom winter is not a pause but a different kind of work. Eli called on Jennie every Saturday afternoon, arriving at 2 and staying through supper, and between these visits, they encountered each other in town with a regularity that the people of Caldwell noticed and discussed, because small towns always notice and discuss these things and are rarely wrong in their conclusions, even when they are premature. He brought her things: a book he had found at the general store, a collection of botanical illustrations that he had thought of immediately when she described her herb garden plans. He brought news of Absalom's progress, which was considerable, and Absalom's recent achievement of responding to his name when called from across the livery yard, which Eli reported with the restrained pride of a man who does not want to appear too invested in the emotional growth of a horse. She made meals and they ate them together, and the table with the third chair was simply a table with 2 people at it now, and this felt not like erasure but like addition. She showed him Thomas's grave on the 3rd Saturday because it felt dishonest not to. It was on the property, as was the practice, at the edge of the eastern field under a single oak tree that had been there when they arrived. The marker was a good stone, carved simply with Thomas Hawkins's name and the years of his life, 1836 to 1872, and the word husband because that was what he had been most fully. Eli stood at the grave with his hat in his hands, and he was quiet for a respectful time. Then he said, "He did good work," and she looked at him and he said, "The land, the well, the barn, all of it is solid. He built well." "He did," she said, and it was not a grief-filled thing the way it had been in the early days, but rather a simple acknowledgment of what was true. And she stood beside Eli at the edge of the field, and the oak tree moved its branches in the November wind, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that she was not alone in caring about what Thomas had built, and that this was not a betrayal of Thomas but a continuation of it. On the ride back to the house, she said, "I want you to know that what I feel toward you is its own thing, not a replacement, not a substitute, its own thing." He looked at her from the saddle, his horse walking easy beside Pearl, and he said, "I know. I have never thought of it any other way." "Good," she said, and they rode the rest of the way in the comfortable silence of people who have said the necessary thing and do not need to repeat it. The Warren Cook trial came in mid-November, and it was the subject of considerable public interest. The courtroom, which was also the town meeting hall, was full to the walls, and Jennie sat in the second row and Eli sat beside her, which no one failed to notice. The lawyer from Wichita was a man named Alderton who wore a coat that was a degree too fine for Caldwell, and spoke with the precise articulation of a man who had practiced his voice in private. He argued that Cook had been confused, frightened during the robbery, had acted in good faith. Amos Reed, Delane's foreman, testified clearly and without contradiction that he had seen Eli Granger in the livery yard at the time of the robbery, and that Cook had approached him afterward and offered him money to change his statement, which Reed had initially taken, and then returned to Prout with a confession and a guilty conscience. Jennie testified about the inconsistencies in Cook's account, formally this time, under oath, and she gave her testimony in the same clear, steady voice she had used at the Gallows, and the courtroom was very quiet while she spoke. She did not look at Eli while she testified, because she was concentrating on precision, but she was aware of him the way she was aware of most things now, steadily, like a landmark you orient yourself by. The verdict took 4 hours. Warren Cook was found guilty of obstruction of justice and filing a false criminal report, and was sentenced to 2 years in the territorial prison at Wichita, plus restitution to Eli Granger for damages. The fine for the restitution was set at the somewhat token sum of $50, which Alderton argued down from $200, but $50 was $50, and it was owed and paid. Afterward, outside the meeting hall in the gray November afternoon, Eli took the envelope with the $50 and held it for a moment and then looked at Jennie. "Thank you," he said, "for all of it, for the first time at the gallows and now." "You would have been released eventually," she said. "The truth would have come out." "Maybe," he said, "but eventually is a very different thing from immediately." He paused. "You saved my life, Jennie. I do not forget a thing like that." She looked at him, and the November light was pale and cold but honest, the way autumn light is honest, showing everything without flattery. "You were worth saving," she said quietly. The air between them had the quality of a held breath, and then she reached out and straightened the lapel of his jacket where the wind had turned it up, a small domestic gesture that she made without thinking, and then she became aware of what she had done and let her hand fall, and he caught it. Not roughly, not suddenly. Just held it, his hand around hers, both of them in the cold November air outside a courthouse where justice had just been served, and she did not pull away. "I intend to ask you something," he said, "but not yet, not until I've earned the right." "You may already have it," she said honestly. "Then I will ask," he said, "when the time is right. When it is not tangled up with all of this courtroom business, and you know for certain that what you feel is what you feel, independent of gratitude." She looked at him with an expression that contained, in equal measure, exasperation and profound tenderness. "Eli Granger," she said, "I am 28 years old and I have been running a homestead alone for 11 months. I know what I feel." "I know you do," he said. "I just want to give it the right kind of asking." She squeezed his hand once, and he let it go, and they walked back toward their horses in the November afternoon, and it was the most romantic thing she could remember, which surprised her, because nothing ostensibly romantic had technically happened. December came down hard and honest, the way December does on the Kansas plains, ice on the water troughs in the morning and the wind carrying something northerly and uncompromising. Eli spent the short days in the warmth of the livery, managing the horses through the cold with extra hay and careful attention, and the long evenings in the small bunkhouse with its single stove, reading whatever he could find and thinking with increasing clarity about the shape his life was taking. He was building something. He could feel it, not yet fully formed but in the process of becoming, the way a frame takes on the suggestion of a house before the walls go up. He had $30 to his name plus the $50 from Cook's restitution, which he had deposited at the merchant's bank with some irony and Prout's endorsement. He was earning $3 a week from Delane, and Delane had mentioned, twice now, in the deliberate way Delane mentioned things that mattered, that he was considering expanding the livery operation and would need a trusted man to manage the additional work. He spoke with Delane directly one Thursday morning in the office above the stable, with the cold pressing at the window glass. "I want to put down roots here," he said. "I want to build something. I am asking whether you see a future for me in this operation." Delane looked at him for a long moment, turning the pen. "I see more than that," he said. "I am 53 years old and I have no children. I have been looking for a man to eventually take over this business, not as a hand but as a partner. I have been watching you for 6 weeks. You have better hands with horses than anyone I have hired in 20 years, and you have better judgment." He set down the pen. "I am proposing a partnership, not immediately but building toward one. You continue at your current wage through the winter. We discuss terms in the spring and I put it in writing." Eli was quiet for a moment, taking the shape of this. "That is a generous offer," he said. "It is a practical one," Delane said. "I need a partner and you need a future, both problems solved." "Thank you, Frank," Eli said. "I will accept, with terms to be discussed in spring." He rode out east that Saturday with something new in his chest, not just the warmth he had been carrying there since October but a specific, structured thing, a confidence that the future was not just possible but being built actively, with good material. Jennie met him at the gate as she had started to do, in her heavy wool coat and her work gloves, pearl-breathing vapor in the cold pasture behind her. She looked at his face when he came through the gate and said, "Something has happened." He told her about Delaine's offer and she listened, and her face went through several things, pleasure and relief, and something else he had started to learn to recognize, a particular quality of a woman who has been alone and has begun to allow herself to believe she might not be. "You are staying," she said. "I am staying," he said. She smiled, a full, unguarded smile that rearranged his whole perception of the December afternoon. They worked on the barn roof that day, clearing ice from the shingles along the south edge where it had built up enough to be a concern, and the work was cold and particular, and she moved across the low pitch of the roof with a fearlessness born of necessity, and he found himself doing what he had started to do without thinking, arranging himself between her and the edge, just in case, without making it a thing. She noticed, because she noticed most things. "I am not going to fall off a roof," she said. "Of course not," he said, moving a sheet of ice with the flat of the spade. "But you are going to stand there just in case anyway," she said. "That seems reasonable," he said. She shook her head, smiling at the shingles, and said nothing else about it. They came down at noon and she made a soup from a ham bone she had been stretching for 3 days, rich and warm, and they sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked, and the conversation had reached the easy depth of people who have been talking for 2 months and have found that there is no bottom to what they want to say to each other. "I want to ask you something," she said, setting down her spoon. He looked at her. "You said once you already have a question for me," she said. "I find that I am tired of waiting for the right time because I am not sure the right time is a real thing. It may be one of those things people wait for and find that they have waited themselves past something they wanted." He was very still. "So I will ask first," she said, "because I am not a woman who waits when she knows her mind." She looked at him across the kitchen table in the warmth of the stove and the gray December light through the window. "Is it your intention to court me, Eli Granger, properly and with purpose?" He looked at her for a moment, and then the smile that she had been collecting, the slow, rare, full one, moved across his face like sunrise. "It is," he said. "It has been since October. I only wanted to give you time." "I have had 11 months of time," she said. "I am ready for something else now." He reached across the table, and this time she was the one who reached back, and their hands met in the space between their coffee cups, and outside the window the December wind moved across the Kansas plain, and the winter sky was wide and cold and clear, and the kitchen was warm with fire, and with something else entirely. January and February passed in that particular way of months that are hard in their conditions, but rich in what they produce in people who share them. The long evenings and the deep, cold, driving conversation deeper, finding things at the bottom of each other that the easier seasons had not yet reached. He told her about his father's death, the actual weight of it, that he had been 17, and the blacksmith shop had become his to run whether he was ready or not, and that he had been angry about this for years before he understood that the anger was grief wearing a harder face. She told him about the year after Thomas died, the specific texture of it, the way she had had to learn to be both people in a partnership that had relied on two, the way she had cried in the barn for weeks and then stopped, not because the grief was gone but because the land needed tending and she had not been willing to let it go. He told her that he had almost left Caldwell after the trial, before the Delane offer, that there had been a morning in late November where the associating of the town with what had nearly happened had been heavy enough that he had saddled Augustus and ridden 6 miles north before he turned back, because the thing that turned him back was specific and had a name, and it lived 2 miles east of town. She said nothing for a moment when he told her this. Then she said, "I am glad you turned back." "I was more glad than I can say," he said. On the second Saturday of February, in the particular clarity of a cold afternoon when the sky was that deep winter blue and the frozen grass caught the light like glass, He walked with her to the eastern field after their work was done, to Thomas's grave under the oak tree. He had not planned this exactly, or he had planned it without knowing he was planning it. He stood beside her at the grave, his hat in his hands. He spoke quietly, not to her but to the marker in the ground. He said, "I do not intend to replace you or the place you have in her. I intend to be worthy of the life you built here, and to add to it, and to make sure she is never alone in this prairie wind again if she will allow it." He paused. "I think you would understand." She was very still beside him, and then she put her hand through his arm, and he felt the warmth of it even through the winter coat, and she leaned against his shoulder very slightly, and the oak tree moved in the cold February air, and the sky above them was enormous and patient. He turned to her and he said, "Jennie Hawkins, I came to Caldwell for a job wrangling horses, and I found considerably more than I was looking for. I found a woman who walked out of a crowd at the right moment and changed the course of everything, and I have thought about nothing more important than her since. I am asking you to marry me, not because I am in a hurry, and not because the prairie is cold, but because I love you, and I believe you are the finest person I have ever known, and I want to build a life on this land beside you and grow old watching you be exactly who you are." She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with things she was not suppressing entirely. "You are the most honest man I have ever met," she said. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "It is a remarkable yes," she said, and she put both hands on his face, and he kissed her there in the February cold at the edge of the eastern field. And it was the kind of kiss that is also a beginning, not tentative, not uncertain, but full of the specific warmth of people who have taken their time with something and are finally, properly arriving. They were married in March, when the first green was beginning to push through the frost-brown grass of the Kansas plain, and the sky had that particular quality of early spring washed clean, full of the promise of growing things. The ceremony was held at the Methodist Church in Caldwell, because Jennie had been a church-going woman her whole life, and because the minister, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Alcott who had arrived in Caldwell 2 years prior from Connecticut and had been consistently surprised by the West ever since, had an earnestness about him that she found, if not inspiring, at least genuine. Frank Delane stood as Eli's witness, and Delane's wife Clara, a solid and warm woman of 48 who had become in the preceding month something of a friend to Jennie, stood as Jennie's witness. Henry Parks, the young livery hand, sat in the front pew and cried, which he denied vigorously afterward and which everyone pretended not to notice. The ceremony was simple and direct. They had written their own vows independently, and discovered when they exchanged them that the language was different but the substance the same, both of them promising honesty, presence, a full and equal partnership, an intention to build something lasting. Reverend Alcott, who had performed perhaps 60 marriages in his career, later told Clara Delane that he could not recall another ceremony at which both people had been quite so clearly saying exactly what they meant. Eli's hands were steady when he put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band that he had made by the jeweler in Wichita at a cost he had been saving toward since December. Jennie's hands were steady because she was a woman who was steady, but he felt the warmth of them and the slight tightening of her fingers around his, and he thought that he would be happy to hold these hands for the rest of his life, and that this was not a small thought. There was a supper afterward at the meeting hall, the same hall where they had sat across a long table in October, and the whole town seemed to come, because in a small place a wedding is always a community event, and this one had a particular story behind it that had added to its significance. The woman who had stepped out of a crowd at the Gallows was marrying the man she had stepped out for, and most people in Caldwell found this either romantic or providential or both. Sheriff Prout came and shook Eli's hand with a firmness that contained an apology he had already made once verbally and was reinforcing through grip. Eli accepted it the way he accepted most things, directly and without unnecessary ceremony. Amos Reed came and said he was glad things had worked out right. Several of the women from the community supper in October came and told Jennie she looked beautiful, which was true. She wore a dress of that deep teal, finely made from the fabric in the millinery window, and she wore her hair down and pinned back only loosely, and she looked like someone who had come through something hard and arrived, at last, exactly where she was supposed to be. They danced. There was a fiddle player named Jacobs and a man with a harmonica, and they played reels and slower things. And Jennie discovered that Eli could dance in the way that self-contained men sometimes can, not with a great deal of flourish, but with a genuine sense of rhythm and an easy confidence in how to lead, and when not to. And they moved around the floor of the meeting hall with the particular pleasure of a first dance that does not feel like performance but like conversation. "You did not tell me you could dance," she said, when they had turned through a slow tune. "You did not ask," he said with a smile. "I am filing this away as evidence that there may be further surprises," she said. "Almost certainly," he said. She laughed, and he held the sound of it the way he held most things about her, carefully, warmly, with the full intention of holding it for as long as he was able. They drove home in the spring evening in the wagon, Jennie's mare tied to the back, Augustus pulling with his usual energetic opinion about direction. The road east out of Caldwell was a road Eli had ridden many times in the preceding months, and it had changed in quality each time, from a stranger's road to a familiar one, from a road he traveled to a road he was coming home on. Now it was something even more particular, and the spring dark lay over the Kansas plain with its particular softness, and the stars were the full blaze of a clear March night, and Jennie sat beside him on the wagon bench with her shoulder against his and his arm around her, and neither of them said much, because the evening had already said what needed saying. The homestead was dark when they arrived, but they had left a lamp turned low in the kitchen window, and it made the light that good lamps in good windows make small, warm, and reliable, visible from a long way off on a dark road. He helped her down from the wagon, and she stood for a moment looking at the house, and he stood beside her and looked at it with her. "Our house," he said. "Our house," she agreed, and the words had a weight in them that was not heavy but full. Spring came fully, and they worked the homestead together, and the quality of the work changed in the way that shared work changes, multiplied in what it could accomplish, divided in what it cost. He took on the heavier jobs without making it a statement about what she could or could not do, and she took on the planning and the detail work that required the kind of patient organization that she had developed in the years of managing alone, and they moved around each other in the routines of daily work with the ease of people whose rhythms have been finding their way toward each other for months and have now arrived. The herb garden went in on the south side of the house in April, exactly as she had planned, with lavender and calendula, and several other things from her grandmother's recipe book. And she worked the beds carefully while Eli turned the fields, and they called back and forth across the yard with the comfortable shorthand of people who do not need complete sentences. The partnership with Delane was formalized in April as well, a written agreement, witnessed by Prout, making Eli Granger the managing partner of the livery operation with a 20% stake, rising to 40% over 5 years, and a clear line toward full ownership in Delane's eventual retirement. He came home from the signing with the document folded inside his coat, and he put it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a moment, and she came to look at it with him. "Eli Granger," she said, reading his name on the document. "That is the one," he said. "Soon it should say Eli Granger and Jennie Granger," she said. He looked at her, slightly surprised by this, not displeased, but surprised. "I liked Hawkins," she said thoughtfully, "but I think I like what comes next more." She looked up at him. "If you would like that." "I would like that very much," he said, and he meant it with a specificity that made her feel the particular warmth of being known. Absalom, the difficult gray gelding, took a shine to Jennie in May. She began coming to the livery on her way through town, bringing a treat or simply stopping to speak to the horses in the quiet way she had. And Absalom, who had been mistrustful of most people for reasons known only to Absalom, permitted her to brush him within 2 weeks, and within a month would follow her around the yard like an oversized, opinionated dog. Eli watched this with what he was absolutely not going to call the fondness of a man seeing the two things he loves best getting along. "He is in love with you," Eli told her one afternoon, watching Absalom lean his heavy head against her shoulder. "He has good taste," she said, scratching behind the gray's ears. "Impeccable," Eli agreed. In June, Jennie told Eli she thought she might be expecting. She told him early on a Tuesday morning before the work had started, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee, because she was not a woman who built up to things when she could simply say them. He went very still in the way of a man receiving news that is larger than he had immediate words for. Then he crossed the kitchen and knelt by her chair and took her hands, and she looked down at him and he looked up at her and he said, "How are you feeling?" "Surprised," she said. "Glad, a little frightened." "We will manage," he said. "Together." "I know," she said. "That is why I am more glad than frightened." He pressed his forehead to their joined hands for a moment, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her knuckles, and the morning sun came through the east window and lay in long stripes across the kitchen floor, and outside the spring had given way to the full green of summer, and everything was growing. The pregnancy moved through summer and into fall, and she continued working the homestead at a pace that the doctor, who had been summoned from 20 miles east for a first consultation, found alarming and she found entirely reasonable. She adapted the physical work as needed, with Eli's assistance and without his interference. He had learned quickly and early that the line between helping and hovering was one she drew clearly, and he respected it, which was one of the reasons things went well between them. He was also, she noted with great affection, terrible at pretending not to worry. He checked on her at the livery when she came through town. He adjusted the height of the water pump handle without mentioning it. He appeared at the kitchen door with supper at the end of work days, with a frequency that he attributed to hunger, and she attributed to something more specific and considerably more endearing. "You are worrying," she said one evening September when he had appeared with the supper and then stayed near the kitchen rather than going to the table. "I am not," he said. "Eli, I may be a little worried," he said. "It is a perfectly ordinary response to circumstances." "I am healthy," she said. "The baby is healthy. Dr. Marsh confirmed it." "Dr. Marsh is 20 miles away," he said reasonably. "Eli," she said softly, "come here." He came. She took his hand and put it flat against the place where the baby moved, and after a moment it did move, a small, fierce, insistent rolling motion, and he went still and his face did the thing it did when something moved him past what words could hold. "He is well," she said. "He," Eli said, looking up. "Or she," she said. "But I think he." She paused. "I have a mother's sense about these things." He curled his fingers gently and said nothing, and they stayed like that in the autumn kitchen. And outside the Kansas evening was going gold and long, and the herbs in the south garden were harvested and hanging in the kitchen rafters, and the homestead was full and warm and real. Their son was born on a November morning, a year almost to the day from Warren Cook's trial, which Jennie thought was a satisfying arrangement of time. The birth was attended by Clara Delane, who had previous experience in this area, and by Dr. Marsh, who had been sent for 2 days in advance and had arrived the evening before on a horse that was considerably more impatient than the journey required. Eli was in the next room and came in the moment Clara opened the door, and he stood at the bedside with Jennie's hand in his, and the expression of a man who has just had something confirmed that he had hoped for but not allowed himself to wholly believe. The baby was red-faced and certain-voiced, and absolutely of the opinion that the world required his immediate assessment, and he had Eli's dark eyes and Jennie's determined jaw and the general manner of someone who intended to be a great deal of work and worth every moment of it. "Thomas," Jennie said, looking at Eli. "Thomas Eli Granger." He looked at her across the baby, at the two of them, his wife and his son, and there was nothing he could say that would adequately do the moment justice. So he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead and stayed there for a moment, and she closed her eyes and held on. Frank Delane became the boy's godfather, a role he accepted with the gruff affection of a man who had spent years telling himself he did not need children and discovered that he had been mistaken. Clara Delane was godmother, and Henry Parks, upon being told the news, became emotional again and again denied it. And the town of Caldwell received the news with the warm collective satisfaction of a community that had seen a story go from a gallows scaffold to a family kitchen table, and approved deeply of the arc. Thomas Eli Granger was 8 months old in the summer of 1875, and by that time he had the specific quality of babies who have been loved without reservation, plump and confident, and possessed of the absolute certainty that the world would respond to his requests. He sat in his father's arms at the livery and watched the horses with the focused attention of someone already making assessments. And Absalom, the difficult gray gelding, who had made his peace with the world in general through the sustained good works of Jennie's consistent kindness, extended his nose toward the baby with a delicacy entirely at odds with his usual personality and blew warm air into the small face, which made Thomas Eli laugh with a sound so surprised and so complete that even Absalom seemed pleased. "He will be a horseman," Eli said. "He will be many things," Jennie said from beside him. "We will let him choose." The partnership with Delane was formalized further that summer, with Eli's stake moved to 30% ahead of schedule, in recognition of what had, under his management, been a significant improvement in the livery's operation. Delane said it plainly. The operation was running better than it had in 20 years. The horses were in excellent condition. The reputation of Delane's livery had improved enough that trail outfits were requesting them specifically as a stop, and this was the direct result of the man he had hired in the fall of 1873. Eli accepted this assessment with characteristic straightforwardness and went back to work. Jennie's herb garden had become something more by 1875. Word had spread, the way word spreads in places where good practical knowledge is scarce, that the woman on the East Road had remedies that worked for common ailments, for the particular challenges of farm and ranch work, for the things that were not worth riding 20 miles to a doctor and not worth suffering through either. Women came to her from the farms around Caldwell, and she gave what she had and what she knew freely, because her grandmother's recipe book had not been a thing kept. It had been a thing given forward, and she understood that. She had begun writing things down, making her own record, and Eli had brought her blank ledger books from town and did not ask what they were for, though he knew, because knowing what she was doing without requiring explanation was one of the practices of his love for her that she found most sustaining. One Saturday afternoon in late summer, sitting on the porch in the long golden evening light, with Thomas Eli sleeping on the blanket between them and the fields green and full, and the whole homestead alive with the sound of summer, she took Eli's hand and turned it over in her lap and traced the scar across his knuckles that she had noticed the first time she handed him the mallet. "Tell me the story of this," she said. He looked at their joined hands. "Smithy accident," he said. "I was 15 learning the work. A piece of iron stock slipped off the anvil and caught my hand." He paused. "My father was furious with me, sent me home to my mother. She bandaged it and said he was frightened, which was why he was angry." "She was right," Jennie said. "She was almost always right," he said. "It is a family trait." She looked up at him, and he was looking at her with that expression she had fully named by now, the one that was steady and warm and particular, the one that was hers and that she had not been looking for when it found her on a morning in October 1873 at the base of a gallows. "I think about that morning sometimes," she said. "The gallows, what made me walk out of the crowd." "What do you think made you?" he said. She considered it, looking at the evening fields. "Honesty," she said. I could not make myself stand in a crowd and watch something happen that I knew was wrong. I could not have done anything else." She paused. "I did not know it would change everything." "Would you have walked out anyway?" he asked. "If you had known." She looked at him, at this man who had come into her life at the end of a rope and stayed to become its center, this patient, honest, remarkable person who had come looking for work and found her and had treated the finding of her like something worth everything he had. "Yes," she said. "I would have walked out anyway. It was right, regardless of what came from it. But I am profoundly grateful for what came from it." He brought her hand to his lips and held it there, and the evening moved around them. The cricket sound and the warm Kansas dark coming down, and Thomas Eli breathing the slow breath of a sleeping baby, who did not know yet what the world cost but was safe from knowing it for a good long while. In the fall of 1876, Jennie told Eli she thought there might be another one coming, and this time she said it with more certainty than surprise, and he received it with more joy than stillness, because they both knew by now that they were capable of what was coming, and that capable was not the same as easy, but that easy had never been the point. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1877, before the bluebell grass was fully up. She had Jennie's eyes, and she made her presence known from the first moment in a way that left no one in any doubt about her intentions. They named her Clara Frances Granger, Clara for the woman who had stood at Jennie's side on two of the most important days of her life, and Frances for Eli's mother in Ohio, who was told by letter and wrote back a reply so full of feeling that Eli had to set it down twice before he could finish it. Thomas Eli, who was 3, approached his sister with the cautious assessment of someone encountering an unknown horse from the side, with measured distance, before deciding this was something he could accept. Within 2 weeks he had adopted her with the decisive affection of a 3-year-old boy who has made up his mind, and by the time she was 3 months old, he was sitting beside her blanket and telling her, in serious detail, about the horses at the livery, which Clara Frances received with the wide-eyed solemnity of a person trying to remember everything. Frank Delane retired from the active management of the livery in 1878, and the partnership document was revised to reflect a transition that had been building toward itself for 5 years. Eli Granger, majority owner and operator of Delane's livery of Caldwell, Kansas, with Delane retaining a consulting stake and an open invitation to come by and look at the horses whenever he liked, which he accepted and exercised regularly. The name stayed Delane's livery because Eli thought Delane had earned it staying, which Delane appreciated more than he said. The homestead prospered. The cattle herd grew modestly, the fields were productive, the herb garden had become a full-scale kitchen garden as well, and Jennie's written record of remedies and practices had become, by 1878, a bound volume that she had made copies of for 3 other women in the surrounding farmsteads, because the knowledge was meant to move. She and Eli sat on the porch most evenings when the work allowed. In the chairs he had made the previous winter 2 of them, side by side, with good arms for resting coffee cups on, which she had specified and he had obliged. From the porch they could see the fields and the eastern sky and the oak tree where Thomas Hawkins was buried at the edge of the pasture, and this view contained, for both of them, the full account of how they had arrived here, what had been and what was still being built. The world moved around Caldwell in the late 1870s. The cattle drives began to slow as the railroad expanded, and the era of the long trail north began its gradual end. The town changed in the ways that towns change, some men leaving, others arriving. A new bank after the old one was reorganized following the Cook scandal. A schoolhouse built in 1877 that Thomas Eli began attending in 1879, with the intensity of a child who has been told by his parents that learning was a privilege, and has taken this instruction fully to heart. Clara Frances began at the school 2 years after her brother and taught herself to read, with Thomas Eli's help, 3 months before she was officially enrolled, because she was that kind of person, and Jennie recognized in her daughter the specific determination that had once walked a woman out of a crowd and told a hangman to stop, and she found it the most recognizable and beloved thing in the world. The October of 1879 was the 6th anniversary of the morning that had begun everything, though they did not make a particular ceremony of it. The date had no official weight. It was not a wedding anniversary or a birthday, but they were both aware of it in the way that people are aware of the specific coordinates of important things. On the evening of that October, with the children in bed and the lamps turned low and the autumn dark outside warm with the last of the season's good air, they sat on the porch and Eli poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot and they sat in their chairs in the old comfortable way. 6 years, she said. Thereabouts, he said. She looked at the dark fields, the stars above the flat horizon, the vast and patient Kansas sky. I sometimes think about what would have happened, she said, if I had not spoken. You would have, he said with certainty. You cannot know that. I know you, he said. You could not have done otherwise. She was quiet for a moment. No, she said, but I am glad I did not have to choose it alone. I am glad you were the one on those steps. He looked at her, and in the dark his face was all the things she knew it to be, steady and warm and particular, the face of the man she had gone toward when she did not know she was going toward anything. There is nowhere else I would have been, he said. She leaned across and took his hand, the one with the scar, the hand she had noticed first, and held it on the arm of her chair, and they sat that way in the October dark, in the good warmth of what they had made together. The house behind them full of sleeping children and drying herbs and the smell of coffee and wood smoke, the land around them quiet and productive in theirs. The lives they had built from a single impulsive act of honesty, and a man who had asked her name before his feet were fully on the ground. The night continued around them, full and unhurried, with all the time in the world. Caldwell moved forward as Caldwell always did, season by season, with its particular mix of the hard and the hopeful. The Granger family was a fixture of it by now. Eli at the livery, known for his excellent horses and his reliable word, Jennie known for her garden and her knowledge, and the quiet way she was someone you could come to with a problem and leave feeling it was something you could manage. Thomas Eli grew into a boy of 9, and then 10 who had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, and an affinity for horses that made Eli feel, privately, that some things are simply inherited at a level below what words can account for. Clara Frances grew into a girl of fierce intelligence and considerable opinions, who had from early childhood the specific quality of a person who is always considering 3 things at once, and is patient enough not to share all of them until the right moment. The years ahead would have their difficulties, as years do. A hard winter in 1880 that took 2 of the cattle and required Eli and Jennie to work together through 3 solid weeks of bitter cold to keep the rest, the horses, and the garden alive, which they did. A flooding spring in 1881 that required the east fence to be entirely rebuilt and took 3 weeks of the best weather. The ongoing changes of a territory becoming a state, which Kansas did in 1861, but was still becoming in its particular customs and laws, the slow recalibration of a place finding its shape. Through all of it they were, as they had been from the beginning, beside each other, not always in agreement, because they were both people of strong minds and the arguments they had were real arguments that required real resolution, not the performing of disagreement for the sake of it. But they came through each difficulty with the specific strengthening that comes from being tested together and finding that the bond holds. By 1882, Jennie's written volume of remedies had been requested by a woman in Wichita who had heard of it through 2 intermediaries, and who wished to make a copy and share it with a newly established women's health society in the city. Jennie sent it with a letter explaining its origins, the grandmother, and the grandmother's grandmother who had carried it north out of slavery, and she said clearly that the knowledge belonged to no single person, but to all the women who had held it and passed it forward, and that the only requirement for its use was that it continue to be given freely. Eli read the letter before she sent it and said, "This is the best thing you have ever written." Looked at him. "Better than my vows," he thought for a moment. "Equally good," he said, "for different reasons." She sent it. The homestead in the spring of 1883 was a different thing from what it had been in 1873. The gray barn had been expanded twice, with a second structure added in 1879 for the cattle and a small workroom for Jennie's botanical work attached to the east wall of the house, with good windows and shelving that Eli had built over a winter weekend. The garden was substantial and organized, with its medicinal beds along the south and its vegetable beds along the east, and in the summer it was a green, fragrant, purposeful place that smelled of lavender and growing things. Thomas Eli, 13 now, spent his afternoons at the livery with his father, learning the horses with the same systematic patience Eli had brought to the work, and had recently made friends with Absalom, the gray gelding, now 21, and settled in his age into a kind of gruff wisdom, in a way that Eli found deeply satisfying. The old horse, who had not warmed to anyone easily in his life, allowed the boy to brush him and lead him and took treats from his hand with the dignity of someone accepting a long-overdue tribute. Clara Frances, at 11, had decided she wanted to be a teacher. She had announced this at supper one evening with the particular certainty of someone who has spent considerable time thinking and has arrived at a conclusion that will not be moved, and both her parents had looked at her and then at each other and said, essentially, that this seemed exactly right. "You will be a remarkable teacher," Jennie told her. "I know," Clara Frances said, without arrogance, just with the simple accuracy of self-knowledge which she had in abundance. Eli laughed at that, the full, open laugh that he still gave somewhat rarely, and that still, after 10 years, made Jennie feel that something excellent had just occurred. "She sounds like her mother," he said. "She is better than her mother," Jennie said, and meant it as a pure compliment, the way you mean it when the person you love most in the world has made something that surpasses you, and you are nothing but glad. On an April evening in 1883, Jennie was working in the herb garden in the late afternoon light, and Eli came out from the barn and stopped at the garden gate, watching her, not because anything particular was happening, but because this was something he still did after 10 years. He watched her move through the beds with her gloves on and her bonnet tipped back from her forehead the way it always went when she was absorbed in what she was doing. And the light was on her, that particular golden April light, and the lavender was coming up and the calendula was just starting, and the house was behind her with smoke from the kitchen stove and the sound of children inside, and the land was all around them, the good Kansas land they had worked and tended and made theirs. She looked up and saw him and said, "Are you going to stand there, or are you going to come and tell me what the calendar situation is for the lavender this year?" "The calendar situation," he said, coming through the gate, "is that it is April and you have 12 weeks to the first real harvest, which is what it was last year." "I thought it might be 11, she said. "12, he said, and crouched beside her to look at the plants, both of them in the garden in the afternoon in the particular companionship of two people who have been doing this long enough that they think better together than separately, and who know it. He pulled a small weed that she had not noticed yet and tucked it in his pocket for the compost, and she watched this small domestic act with an expression that was entirely private and entirely full. "Eli," she said. He said, examining the root ball. "I love you," she said. She said it the way she had learned to say it over the years, not in the charged moments only, but in the ordinary ones, the garden ones, because the ordinary ones were what a life was mostly made of, and they deserved the same weight. He looked up from the lavender plant, and his eyes were the same dark brown that had been watchful and still at the base of a gallows scaffold on an October morning 10 years ago, and they were the same eyes that had looked at her across a kitchen table in a new town in November, and across a fire in the winter dark, and from the back of a horse on a spring road, and all the accumulated looking was in them now, everything they had been to each other. "I love you," he said, and then he went back to the lavender which needed attention, and she went back to the calendula which also needed attention, and the garden grew around them in the Kansas spring, and the children's voices came from the house, and the horses moved in the pasture, and the wind moved across the plain the way it always had and always would, vast and indifferent and also, somehow, like a witness. The life they had was not perfect. No life is. But it was honest, and it was full, and it was built on a foundation that had been laid in a single impulsive act of justice on a windy October morning, when a widow had stepped out of a crowd to speak for a stranger and changed the whole direction of what was possible. And the stranger had looked at her with the eyes of a man at the end of everything and asked her name, as though it was the only thing that mattered in that moment, as though the name of this woman was the thing worth knowing more than any other, even standing on a gallows with the rope around his neck and the Kansas sky wide and blue above him. "Jennie Hawkins," she had said. And he had held the name, and he had come looking for its owner when his feet were free, and he had found her with a mallet in her hand at a fence line, and he had held a post for her without being asked, and everything had followed from that. The coffee and the meals and the kitchen table and the grave in the eastern field and the February cold and the wedding in March and the children sleeping in the house and the garden in the spring light and the 2 chairs on the porch and all the years of it, all of it from that single morning, that single name, that single honest act of a woman who could not stand in a crowd and watch something wrong and do nothing. It was enough for a whole life. It was, in the end, everything.